just waking up, about to take a midday nap, or about to go to bed when you're watching this video, we don't care. We're just glad that you're watching the video at all. You could be doing so many other things right now, and you chose us. So thank you for taking the time to make us a part of your life. My name is Rachel, and I hope you're not getting tired of seeing me, because I'm here once again to get us started. Today we're on part 5 out of our 6-part series called You're Not the Boss of Me. We've almost made it to the end, you guys. We can totally do this. Say it with me. How to say no to the emotions that compete for control. Because we all have emotions that are competing for control of our lives. They all compete for control, not just some of them, and sometimes it's more than one at a time. And they always want control over our moods and our mouths. Our moods and our mouths can definitely get us in trouble and undermine the relationships that are most important to us. Now, so far in this series, we've talked about guilt, envy, and anger. And to each one of those, we have said, you are not the boss of me. Like I've been saying all along, this isn't going to make any sense if you haven't watched the last 4 weeks' videos. It's worth your time to stop and go back and watch the last several weeks and get caught up, because you're going to want today to make sense. For everyone else who is caught up, we're going to continue on and are going to talk about yet another emotion that lurks inside of us and how it affects our hearts. It's an emotion that Jesus talked about a lot, so we definitely want to pay close attention to this. So, scooch in nice and close and turn the volume all the way up. Let's get the drop on what's going on with Bridge Church.
What's up? My name's Zach, and you're about to get the drop. Thanks for watching, but we really want to get everyone in a circle. If you don't have a circle, join our Sunday circle. Can I say my address? You can find the address on the website under the Circles tab. If you're not ready for a circle, we get it. That can be weird. Instead, come hang out at 5 p.m. It's a fun time to get to know people before sharing your life. All of the information can be found on the website under the Events tab. By now, everyone's back to school. Whether online or in person, it's just different this year. If there's anything really frustrating, don't keep it to yourself. Please let us know if we can help. All of the ways that you can reach us can be found on our Facebook page. For more information on what's happening, go to our Facebook page or go to bridgedayton.com. Oh, that's my marshmallow. And now, here's my dad with part 5 of the series, You're Not the Boss of Me.
I have a nasty little habit. I love to scare people. I love to be in my car as my son is getting home from school and be hiding and waiting for him to open the door. And when he comes in unsuspectingly, I love to honk my car horn and watch him jump. I love to see a friend in a store and work my way around behind them. I'll even go as far as like climbing in a rack of clothes or getting other people in the store on board with me just to see the fear on their face. Because fear is a powerful emotion that creates a physical response many times. And I enjoy seeing that moment of fear followed by the moment of elation that everything is okay. So today, we're going to talk about this powerful emotion called fear. And what's interesting to me, and I hope it'll be interesting to you, is that Jesus said so much about fear. But what Jesus says about fear seems very naive if you look at it in isolation. And one of the problems with how the Bible is generally presented is that we drop into an isolated event in the life of Jesus and we turn it into like this little mini story. You know, like once upon a time, blah, 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 the end. And this is no one's fault. We just do this as human beings. But Jesus' entire ministry, he was teaching his apostles how to not be afraid. I mean, if you just look at the ultimate bottom line of Jesus' teaching about fear, it was fear not. Just quit being afraid. Cut it out. Which it's like, thanks, Jesus. Very helpful. To use our terminology, Jesus was saying, don't let fear be the boss of you. And his first century followers, they felt a lot of the same ways as we do. Jesus would say, fear not, don't be afraid. And they would believe him, but they would wonder, what does that even look like? How do you do that? And doesn't that seem kind of impossible, Jesus? Well, on one occasion, Jesus gets his apostles together and he says, here's the big picture. Here's what's going to happen in your lives. I'm going to send you out like sheep among wolves. Now, to us, that's just like a figure of speech. But in their time, they had seen this. They know that that doesn't end well. Jesus basically says, here's the good news now that you've signed on to this whole movement that I'm, a part of. I'm sending you out and you're going to be arrested and beaten and some of you are going to be killed. And then he wraps it all up by saying, but don't be afraid. And they had to be looking at each other like, did we miss something here? And eventually they were sent out, and eventually they were all arrested, and eventually they were all beaten, and many of them were executed. But just saying don't be afraid at the end of a sentence, it doesn't take away the fear. And it didn't even make any sense to them at the time. So Jesus took them on a field trip. And this is what we miss in 21st century as readers. Now, you are very familiar with this field trip if you grew up in the church, but when you read it or when you were taught about it growing up, you didn't think it was a field trip. You read it or were taught it as an isolated incident in the life of Jesus and in the life of his followers. But everything that Jesus did was so purposeful and it was headed somewhere. So this was the field trip that Jesus set up to teach them a lesson about fear. And as soon as I start this, many of you are going to want to rush ahead to the end because you know the story and you've heard it, all of your life growing up, but purposefully slow yourself down. In Matthew 8, Jesus takes the guys out, they get into a boat, and they row out into the Sea of Galilee. And Matthew tells us that suddenly a furious storm came upon the lake so that the waves swept over the boat. Now, this wasn't unusual for the Sea of Galilee. And these are people who are very familiar with this region of the world. Many of them were even fishermen. So this isn't an exaggeration when they say, that this was unusually bad. And these aren't like very large boats either, so danger's imminent at this point. Now, don't picture Sunday school flannel graph, They're on a small boat in the middle of a big sea. They can't see land on either side of them because of all the dark clouds. It's raining sideways. Their hair is matted to their face. This is not pretty at all. Don't picture rock star Jesus. And it's loud. If you've ever been on a boat and a storm hits and you're trying to talk to somebody, you have to get right in their face, or you have to yell. So Matthew says, and Peter would later confirm, that Jesus was sleeping during all this, which is almost impossible. In fact, I wonder if Jesus was just faking it. That thing that you do with your kids when you're trying to mess with them, they're like, Daddy, Daddy. I just don't know how in the world he was sleeping during this time. But here's Jesus. He's laying down, more than likely soaking wet, with roaring winds and waves and rain. And the disciples, they go and they try to wake him up. And again, like they didn't come and gently stir him, like waking up a small child early in the morning. No. They're screaming and they're yelling, Lord, save us. We're going to drown. And Jesus props up, on one elbow. He doesn't even get up. And he says very loudly, I'm sure, you of little faith. What'd you say, Jesus? It's a really small space. We know it's a small boat. We're about to die. No, you of little faith. And he's yelling because it's loud. And I think he's grinning while he's doing it because he's watching them panic. And then he asks a ridiculous question that no one would ever make up about this whole thing. He says, why are you so afraid? Well, Jesus, we're afraid because there's a furious storm, and the boat's about to sink, which means that we are probably going to drown and die. And when you may drown and die, you are afraid. What a stupid question. Now, we've been taught this as a miracle story to show that Jesus has power over nature, but it's really not. Jesus is teaching them a lesson about fear. And look what it says next. This is hilarious. Then he, finally, got up. He didn't panic because God doesn't panic. We are the ones who panic. And we panic because we project into the future based off of what we know and what we've seen and what we've experienced. But God, who created time, does not panic. This is what Jesus wants them to see, and perhaps what he wants you and I to see today. He gets up and he rebukes the wind and the waves, and then it's completely calm. Now, it's not unusual in this region for storms to barrel down through the valley to create havoc, and then after a little while they just kind of move on through. But for whatever reason, as soon as Jesus started talking, the storm moved on through right then. And what happens next is the point of this. The men were amazed, and they asked a really good question. What kind of man is this? Even the winds and the waves obey him. Now, of course, they were amazed, right? And their question is actually perfect. In fact, that is the most important question to ask. If you're not a believer, or if you used to be a believer, if you went away from Christianity, or maybe you're considering it now, this is the question. I mean, did God create the world? Is there a creator? How big is the universe? Those are all very interesting things to talk about, but this is the question. And Mark, who writes about this, says that as these men looked and pondered this question, that they feared a great fear. This sounds to me a lot like when I don't know how to put something into words, and so I just get it out somehow in the hopes that the people around me can get the idea of what I'm saying. I mean, he repeats himself. It's as if he was saying, we were afraid, and then we were really afraid. We were afraid of the storm, and then we realized who we were in the boat with. This is so important. Their final fear was greater than their first fear. Their fear of whose presence they were in was greater than the fear of the storm and death. And for a brief moment, their confidence in Jesus, it just overwhelmed their fear. But it was just a moment. Their confidence in Jesus and what he was capable of overwhelmed their fear. And the lesson that Jesus was trying to teach them was the same lesson for us. We do not have to allow fear to be the boss of us because there's just something more overwhelming. There's something more capable and powerful than fear. So then a few days later, while it's still fresh on their minds, Jesus comes back to this topic. Like a good teacher, he's saying, hey, we had a field trip. It didn't go so well, but now we're removed from it. We're back to normal. Let's kind of talk about what happened here. And he gives them an illustration from nature. He says, do not be afraid of those who kill the body but cannot kill the soul. Rather, be afraid of the one who can destroy both soul and body in hell. Essentially, Jesus is saying, don't be afraid of anything that can kill your body. Don't be afraid of things that threaten your body but cannot kill your soul. Jesus is underlining something that many of us grew up being taught. There's a you that goes beyond the you that we can see. Basically, if you're going to fear something or someone, it should be God. If you're going to fear someone, you should fear the one that controls your soul, not just someone who can control your body. Remember the boat ride? You were afraid of the wrong thing. You were fearing for your life, fearing for the storm. But there was something or somebody that you should have been more afraid of. And then he says this, are not 2 sparrows sold for a penny? Yet not one of them will fall to the ground outside of your Father's care. And we don't know, of this, but this was their world they lived in. This was common knowledge. And this is very personal to them because these sparrows were basically useless. But Jesus says that God cares about them. So God cares about nature? Of course, he cares about nature. He created it. It's his. But more than the sparrows, guys, let's talk about you. And even the very hairs of your head are all numbered. So don't be afraid. You are worth more than many sparrows. This was Jesus' way of saying God is a personal God, and he knows your name and your circumstances and is concerned with you. He knows what's going on and he cares. And for many of us, in the darkest moments, facing the thing that just overwhelms us with fear, if we can know with confidence that God knows what we're going through, and Jesus says, rest assured, God knows and he cares. Even when bad things are happening, even when your prayers go seemingly unanswered, you can trust him. He knows, he cares. So they're finally starting to get it. We were afraid because there was something to be afraid of, but really we got our eyes off of what we should really fear, and you're with us, Jesus, going through the trials of life. So we don't have to fear. And Jesus is like, I think you're getting it. Let's go on another field trip. This time it starts off really well. This time they're out in the middle of nowhere. Jesus has finished speaking. The sun is going down. There's thousands of hungry people there. And after an exchange with the disciples and a little boy's lunch and a miracle feeding, the apostles' confidence is at an all-time high. Like, look at what Jesus did through us. And people are just like, and who is this man? This is amazing. And what happens next? It isn't a coincidence. Immediately, Jesus made the disciples get into the boat. Now, this Greek word translated made is a really important word. It basically means that Jesus coerced them. He's pretty much forcing them because he doesn't want their heads to get big. This wasn't an invitation like, hey, maybe we should get in the boat and go. Jesus rounds them up and he tells them to get in the boat. And why did he ultimately have to coerce them to do that? They remembered the last boat ride. They're like, no more boating with Jesus. We'll just walk if we have to leave. But Jesus persisted. No, get on the boat. So he makes them to go and get on the boat and to go ahead of him to the other side while he dismisses the crowd. And so they realize he's not even going to go with them, which they had to be thinking like, this is not going to go well. So here's Jesus, pushing the boat out into the water. He's like waving and the apostles start rowing, to where they're supposed to go. Well, the next thing you know, hours have passed and they are just stuck in the middle of the Sea of Galilee. They are rowing against a headwind and they're committed. But they are just, on a rowing machine. They are getting nowhere. And then shortly before dawn, which means that they had been out there almost all night long, Jesus went out to them walking on the lake. Now, if you're not a Christian or used to be, I understand what might go through your mind at this very point. You're like, okay, calming the storm, maybe. Maybe not. Maybe it was just a quick one and, it was a coincidence, the timing of it. But this, John, is why I can't believe the Bible. Now you're telling me I have to believe that Jesus walked on water? Okay, I get it. So let me say something about this really fast and then we'll move on. Christians don't believe that Jesus walked on the water because the Bible tells us. It's actually way better than that. Matthew, who was there, he told us. Mark, who got the story from Peter, who was there, told us. John, who was with Jesus from the start until the end, he told us. They were all three eyewitnesses who were there, and they would say, I know it's crazy. I'm just telling you, this is what happened. Not only do they tell us that this is what happened, they tell us something else. They tell us their embarrassing response to what happened, to seeing him walk on the water. And here's why that's really important. Literary critics use a device called the criteria of embarrassment. And it goes something like this. If someone's writing a story about respected people, they don't invent stories that make those respected people look bad. So if there's an account in a story that makes that person look bad, it's probably authentic because no one would have made it up to make their respected person look bad. Not only would they not have made it up, but they would have probably, if true, left it out. One of the things that people who have rejected Christianity and eventually become Jesus followers once they begin interacting with the text is because they run into this criteria. They realize that the accounts of Jesus don't make the heroes look like heroes. They make them look normal or sometimes less than normal. They are as fearful and as doubtful as everyone else. So the men who were there don't just tell us that Jesus walked on the water, but they tell us how they responded. And no one would have made this up because when the Gospels were written, these guys were still alive. They were the rock stars of the fledgling Christian community of that time. They were respected. If anything, they would have left these embarrassing details out of this. Nobody would have invented a detail that would undermine the credibility of these men. So here's what happened. And honestly, who can blame them for this? When the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. "It's a ghost," they said, and they cried out in fear. Is that really what happened, Matthew? Yeah, we just freaked out. Peter, you've spent your whole life on the lake. You know about seeing things. I know, it's embarrassing, but we were scared. Are you sure you want me to write this in here? Yeah, it's what happened. That's what went on. He quickly addresses them in their fear because he says to them, "Take courage. It is I. It's me. Guys, don't be afraid." How many times do we have to go through this? We've had field trips. You've listened to sermons. You've seen miracles. Stop being afraid. As long as I'm here, there's no need to fear. And even when there's something to be afraid of, you don't have to allow fear to be the boss of you. But again, it just didn't stick with those guys, which should be so encouraging to us. These guys feared right up to the very end. And at the end of Jesus' ministry, they're on their way to Jerusalem. They've just raised Lazarus from the dead. All-time high. They're thinking, this is it. They're welcomed by crowds and they're chanting Jesus' name, Jesus. And it turns political because everyone is expecting him to just take over as king. They hang around there for about a week. They have a Passover meal together. And Jesus says, "I'm establishing a new covenant." It's brand new. It's a relationship between God and man. It's all new. And I've already told you that we're going to start a new movement. This is my ecclesia. I'm going to give you in this ecclesia a new command. And this is what they've been waiting for. The Messiah reestablishing the nation and the kingdom of Israel, overthrowing the Romans. But later that night, he's arrested. And what do? They panicked. They lie, they deny, they cry, they run away, and then they watch him dragged to a hill and crucified. And when they knew that he was dead, they're like, it's over. We don't know who he was. We thought that we did. It was exciting, but now it's over. We were convinced this was a man of God who was God, but clearly we were wrong. We either misunderstood what he was saying or he lied to us. But then they peeked into an empty tomb. And then they met their living friend. And they were back in because the resurrection punctuated every single thing that Jesus taught and said about himself. And when Jesus rose from the dead, suddenly, for the first time, it all made perfect sense. Especially what Jesus had to say about fear. And don't miss this. For us, the resurrection is about Easter. For them, the resurrection was about everything. Every day. Their source of confidence, boldness, and strength, the resurrection validated everything he had ever taught, especially what he had said about fear. Now, the world continued to be a very scary place, especially for these guys, but they didn't have to be afraid because they had the greater fear. They finally got the lesson of the boat rides, the lesson of the sparrows. They finally understood, fear not, I am with you. And they feared not. And we can't imagine this because we have no parallel, but they came out of hiding eventually, and they willingly faced down the very men that had arrested and beaten and crucified Jesus. And then they went on to change the world because fear not, change the world. And it can change your world. Because when you worship someone who has mastered life and conquered death, and he says to you, fear not, you can trust him, not because there's nothing to fear, but because I've put my attention on the one who deserves my trust, my reverence, and my fear. But I understand that fear is a permanent struggle in the human experience, and there are lots of ways that we all try to cope. But none of us wants fear to be the boss of us. And Peter, who failed all the field trips, Peter, who denied that he even knew Jesus after that amazing Passover meal, Peter, who panicked during Jesus' arrest, that same guy who lied and hid in the most fearful moments, he later would say something to the first century Christians, the people who, like us, believed but had never seen Jesus. And here's what he said to them and us based on his experience with Jesus. He says that we've been invited to throw everything on him. And how does that help, Peter? Because I know from firsthand experience that he, Jesus, cares for you. Literally speaking. Transfer your worry to Jesus. This is the invitation to follow Jesus and a promise of a full life not weighed down by fear. To investigate what it looks like to fear not and how to ultimately hand your worry off to Jesus, join a circle and talk about this honestly. If you don't have a circle, join us at 4 p.m. on Sundays for our Sunday circle. And then tune in next week for the exciting conclusion to You're Not the Boss